Okay, from the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, chapter 16, we got to the laws of putting out fire on Shabbat, and today we're going to conclude going through the Shulchan Aruch and Yalkut Yosef, which was compiled by Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef, the son of Haim Ovadia Yosef, the former chief rabbi. So we'll go through this and see how it changed within the last 500 years. So in the commentary of Rabbi Yosef Karo on the tool in the Bet Yosef on the laws of putting out a fire, he says this. We read some of it yesterday. ועכשיו נהגו ברוב הארצות לכבות דלקה בשבת. Most people in most countries, and for him most countries it's the known world of then. This is before the discovery of or the migration to America. So we're talking about Europe, Western Europe, North Africa, Middle East. Most people put out fire on Shabbat. ואין להם על מה שיסמוכו, but there's nothing that they could rely on in terms of halacha. But they have their own argument saying that they're afraid that because of the fire, young children who cannot escape will be harmed. That is one concern. It says the other concern is that the government will punish them. Remember, we spoke about that in medieval times, because the way people started living in big cities, made houses made of wooden houses, very close to each other. So fires were devastating. So the government started each princehood or kingdom made its own rules, but basically people became more aware of the need to have communal responsibility to put out fire. The fire is not in your house. It's a hazard for the whole city. So it became punishable if you didn't participate or if you caused fire. לפיכך מכבין, הליבה דרבי שמעון. And he goes on to say, he quotes a former posek, someone, he quotes a Rabbi, the Mordechai. Yesh merabotenu shamu. He says some people say that you could put out the fire even if you're only concerned about money, because it could affect other things, and that is because even though those two categories are included in the melachot of Shabbat, to create a fire and to extinguish a fire, one of them is called melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Remember we spoke about that? Melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, an action that is not really needed. I mean, when at the end of your action, there's no product. Every action that we do on Shabbat with a purpose, when we end the action, there's a product that we created, right? For example, grinding, you have flour. Planting, you have seeds in the ground. Cooking, you've created food which is edible. With putting out fire, what did you do? You've extinguished the fire. The fire is gone, but you didn't create anything new that is now the result of your action. That's called melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, that nothing was produced with your action. The action was only meant to prevent something. The only exception with mechabeh, with extinguishing a fire, is when you created something new and better because of your action, and that is when you turned wood into coal, or when certain types of metal go through the process called in Hebrew hisum, which now the metal is stronger. That will be the only time when you put out a fire, and it will be punishable. Other than that, it's called melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. And they say hilkach, and it says because we hold, according to the opinion, that if there's no purpose in the action per se, it is not forbidden. Hilkach shari afilu b'Shabbat kemo mishum ibud mamon. He says, according to that, it would be allowed to put out fire on Shabbat, even if your only concern is monetary. But Rabbi Yosef Karo rejects it. It doesn't hold like that. Then, but what we see is that some rabbis try to rationalize the need to extinguish a fire. So they came with different arguments, and whereas others said we don't extinguish a fire unless there is an immediate threat. This is we could say that the give and take, the negotiation between the rabbis, is not is not based on halakha, but rather on a feeling. One rabbi feels it's important to extinguish the fire, and then he goes into the sources of halakha and try to. The same thing happens with lawyers, with judges, Supreme Court. In many cases, you've already made the decision based on your feeling and your notions, and then you go and you try to find sources for that. And the other rabbis feel that it's inappropriate to extinguish fire on Shabbat unless it's for its great need, so they reject all the other arguments. Bagaot Asheri, Rabbeinu Asher, from the 40th century, Katav B'Shem Or Zarua, the very important posek from Vienna. Most of the Ashkenazi halachot are based on his books. מותר לכבות את הדלקה בזמן הזה, מפני שאנו דרים בין הגויים ושוללים והורגים, ולא גרע מעיר הסמוכה לספר. Another rabbi came with this argument. The halacha says, and that's in the Mishnah, that if you live in a city next to the border, then any act of aggression from your neighbors, when we say about the border with a non-Jewish nation who are technically enemies. So any movement on the other side of the border, you could be Mechalel Shabbat. Meaning they didn't attack you yet, but you see that they're moving their forces there, you can mobilize your forces to this side. They say, Afilu ba'u al iskei kash v'teven. Even if you think they're just going to come and steal your hay and straw for their animals, it could escalate and become a violent war. So they say in the same manner, they say in the time of the Mishnah, when they spoke about fire, people lived usually in segregated communities. There were Jews here, non-Jews there. But now we live amidst non-Jewish towns, and when something like that happens, the non-Jews would come into our neighborhoods and loot our houses, and we must defend ourselves. And he says, "Va'afilu b'safek sakana gedolei Yisrael mechabim et hadleka." And he was even more strict in saying that even if there's only a doubt whether something might happen, you call the greatest rabbis and scholars to put out the fire, to show that it's a mitzvah. Ve'had me'agdolim, and also Trumat HaDeshen. This is all Ashkenazi rabbis that say that not only you're allowed, it's a mitzvah, and they, one of them spoke publicly. This is quoted by Trumat HaDeshen, Rabbi Israel Isserlin, also 14th century Germany. Mutar lechabot hadleka b'Shabbat b'zman hazeh. He said it publicly in the synagogue, and then he said, I taught this halacha to the public, so I will not be blamed of criminal negligence. If I don't tell people that, I will be responsible for their lives.
Do you think that was affected by the style of
yes,
living in the towns?
Definitely, right. The reason, right, what I was saying, the reason that the Ashkenazi rabbis tended more towards being what we could call lenient or more, I would say, proactive in encouraging people to extinguish fire on Shabbat is because the cities in Europe, first of all, mostly the houses were wooden houses, clustered together, and because of the weather, fire was burning in the houses much more, and there was a much greater fear of all the great fires that I mentioned yesterday. Most of them happened in Europe and not in the Middle East. The Middle East, the building usually was stone, and because of the weather, were open windows. There were less fire in the houses. So yes, that definitely is a factor, and that's also affected the government. The government took more care of or took notice of fires because it was more common in those parts. And he says not only that he should have notified the people, Hanishal hareze megune. If anyone has to go and ask a question, should I extinguish the fire or not? This is repugnant. It's a problem. People shouldn't ask questions. Some people say that only when the fire started in a house of a Jew, it's a danger, because that would be punishable by death. In some countries, if they found out the house where the fire started from, they would kill the owner of that house by throwing it into the fire. It was done in order to deter people from, to make sure that they're more careful, because it's a harsh punishment. And they said if it started the house of a non-Jew, we don't have to be concerned. But finally, they come with this argument. That the fear is that if the non-Jews are going to loot the city, the Jewish neighborhood, and the Jews are going to confront them, someone will be killed in that confrontation, and then we want to save the life of the Jew who potentially is going to try to protect his property. So we see how many arguments and counter arguments where it really stems from the question of what was the decision that the rabbi already made, yes or no, and then trying to defend it. I think that one of the key elements that we see here is this: it was very hard for the rabbis, even in the 15th century, to say clearly that our understanding of fire has changed. They can't say, because then they will say that the rabbis of the Mishnah did not anticipate that possibility. So they try to come with all kind of side arguments, really destroy, like the non-Jews live with us, they're going to loot us, we're going to defend ourselves, and this is going to happen, and that is a completely different reality than what was at the time of the Mishnah, but it is not directly related to the nature of fire. But what they should have said is, at the time of the Mishnah, fire was not dangerous the way it is today, and because it is a danger, we move on. But that's a statement that's hard for people to say within the world of Jewish law and law in general, because then the fear is that you open the gate to what people call the slippery slope, that you're going to go and revise every halakha and say, then if that's true. In many cases things were different, but anyway, that is how it works. So now we move 500 years forward to the Yalkut Yosef, written by Rabbi Yitzhak Yosef, who is now the chief rabbi, but it's all based on the writing of his father. And he says this: if there is a fire on Shabbat, and it's clear that there's no threat to life, you cannot put out the fire, cannot extinguish it directly. You cannot even call the firefighters. You can only do it in the ways mentioned in the Mishnah, putting bottles with water, like creating a water wall, trying to prevent the fire from spreading. But if there is even the slightest fear, you should do it directly and summon the firefighters. And he says, "Kayom arbe me'adlekot yesh b'hem sakana, or lefahot safek sakana." Today, all fires are potentially dangerous, or at least questionably dangerous. Now, like I said, the fact is that every fire is dangerous. It's not even the smallest thing. He doesn't say that. He will say later on that an observant Jew has a problem being a firefighter, because sometimes the commanders would say you have to put out that fire, and it's not life-threatening. I'll give you one example that to show where even when the authorities think it's not dangerous, it is dangerous. During the floodings in Houston, there was a chemical plant that the generators failed, and therefore the heat in they were making natural organic fertilizers, and eventually they burned, and the firefighters were there, and they were promised that it's not dangerous. They say the smoke is not dangerous because all the ingredients, it's not chemicals. Usually when a chemical plant is burning, chemical fertilizers releases very dangerous fumes. But that was all organic, and they said there's no danger there. Then people were harmed. People who inhaled this smoke, working there, were harmed. So I was listening to an interview discussing that, and as they were talking, I realized what was the problem, and they said it. It was not the fertilizers that was a problem. It was the plastic containers. There were huge plastic vessels. Nobody thought of that that when it burns, the plastic also burns, and then that is the dangerous element. So just to show you, now nobody could really calculate or foresee how it's going to spread. So he says, if the building stands by itself and everybody left the building, then you cannot extinguish the fire unless there are winds. I mean, where do you stop here? But the interesting thing is the commentary here, that became a problem for the rabbis who live in modern Israel. To go back to what we said in the Shulchan Aruch, what was their argument of in favor of extinguishing fire on Shabbat? We live among the non-Jews, and they will punish us if we don't put out the fire by death, or they will loot our neighborhoods, and when we'll defend ourselves, we're in danger. So, by that logic, now that you live in Israel, in cities that are the majority is Jewish, there's no such fear, there's no such concern. Nobody's going to loot your neighborhood.
But what about if you have a home, you can studying the Torah. But if you don't have a home, where are you going to study?
Right, that is. Your argument is really what the other, the Mordechai and the Ravia were saying, that even for monetary, even not just for learning Torah, you need a place to live. And if putting out extinguishing a fire is not directly forbidden on Shabbat, the repercussions of not putting out a fire in the long term, it's going to be a burden on the city, on the economy, emotionally for people. Why stop it? So, but now we're going back to this argument. But as I said, logically, if you said that the reason that you're allowed to extinguish fire is fear of the non-Jews, now that you live among Jews, you're not allowed to extinguish fire on Shabbat. That's what the rabbi should have said. So he writes here's the commentary. Hazonish, Rabbi Ramshayo Karelitz, who's the head of the Lithuanian Litvak Haredi world in Israel, and is considered their halachic authority. Hitir lechabod lekab b'Shabbat av be'eretz Yisrael. He says you could extinguish fire for Shabbat even in Israel, and he relies on the ruling of the Rema that we mentioned before, B'Moshe Yisraelis. Av she'arema natan ta'am she'anu shurim ben hagoyim ve'yesh badleka sakanat nefashot. Even though he ruled that the danger is because we live among non-Jews, however, since he already says it's okay, his ruling is valid even in Israel. See the logic in that? No logic in that. It's completely illogical. This is illogical.
I've heard that logic in other texts.
But it's completely illogical. It's what it comes from. It comes from the denial, not being willing to say that the ancient halacha doesn't apply today. Instead, you try to say the ancient halacha applied always. Then in Europe there was another concern that we have to use, and now we still rely on it. You can't say that. If in the past people died of fever, right, and today people don't die of fever, are you going to assess the halacha or not? If in the past, and that same logic, by the way, one of the classic cases is the treatment of preemies on Shabbat. The Gemara ruled that a preemie that was born on the 8th month is basically dead, because the survival rate for preemies born on the 8th month were very low. They say you cannot touch it on Shabbat, you cannot move it on Shabbat, because it's muktzeh. It's like a stone. It's a long story. Then, because they didn't know better, and it is true that preemies born in the 7th month of pregnancy have higher survival rates than the 8th month. Today, most of them survive, but when they didn't have advanced techniques, because the 8th month is when it's sort of a transition stage between breathing water and oxygen in the lungs. So It's half the lungs are not developed. But before that, there's a safer state for the fetus. However, in modern times, once the rabbis realized that preemies born after 8 months have high survival rates and equal to any other preemie, even 6 months and so on. So they say that today this halakha has changed because we have better medical treatment, right? But according to that logic, the halakha would be that if a woman gave birth to a baby like that and she lives in a remote place where there's no access to medical treatment, she wouldn't be allowed to touch her child on Shabbat because there's no way to save this child, right? And instead they say, no, once we said it, it applies everywhere. So there's the same logic. We understand, the rabbis really understand, consciously or subconsciously, that the reality has changed, that the ancient halakha doesn't apply today, but they're not willing to say it. So instead, they create arguments that seem logical, but are not logical. I'm saying this is definitely is criticism, that we have to take each argument and analyze it and see if it holds ground or not.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
do they differentiate between a fire that you started for heat in a fireplace versus a fire that's out of control?
Any fire can become out of control very fast.
Even in a fire, even though
Yeah.
every night you
No,
light
but-
the coals.
No, so if you have fire in your fireplace and it's in a protected area, you're not going to put it out on Shabbat.
Okay.
So it's better not to start, not put it in the fireplace
But it's cold. And
I know. I did one last night, and but I didn't put it out. It was dying out, but I went back to check, in the middle of the night. But yeah, it is a problem. Finally, so if to sum up the way he rules, even though it makes this, like I said, illogical statement saying that we can still do it in Israel, even though we live among the Jews, basically the understanding is that every fire is potentially dangerous. But then at the same chapter they speak about what happens if your tablecloth caught fire or the rug caught fire. If you think it's going to spread, put it out. But if you don't think it's going to spread, you cannot put it out directly, but rather pour water on the other side of the tablecloth. But don't pour clean water because this is like washing, but rather put dirty water. I mean, this is really seriously. Even if we say that putting clean water on a piece of a garment is washing, when the other side is burnt, that's not washing. You're never going to use it anyway. But that shows like how hard it is for the modern poskim to adjust to their thinking to different to new situations. Finally, then that's halakha that's important to mention. That I think to me it's lamentable that we have that. It says that the firefighters should be careful not to do something that's not needed on Shabbat, and therefore, if they were called to put out a fire and they found out that there's no danger, they cannot extinguish the fire, even if they were going to be fired. So that will cause a situation where an observant person who is a firefighter, right, and is being summoned to a place with his troop, and they come there, and he says, "Oh no, I don't think I should put out that fire." So that creates a conflict. So he says those religious firefighters should always consult rabbis and learn the halachot. And if you want to continue being on the field and as a firefighter, you have to know all the laws. And if you can't do it, don't work on Shabbat or don't do avodah miftzait, like don't be on the actual firefighting, but do support stuff and office work. Now, why I'm saying this halakha is problematic, because this is where we in Israel it creates a a division, a rift between the observant and the non-observant people. Because now, what is the outcome in the long term of this halakha? It is that only the non-observant should be policemen, soldiers, firefighters. I mean, if you need to, because they will end up doing stuff on Shabbat that is not allowed. Instead, the halakha should be that we should encourage as many more observant people to join. This is a burden, this is a responsibility that belongs to the whole community, and there's really no concern of what he said. What if it is not immediately needed on Shabbat? Because you cannot isolate one case. In their line of work, the firefighters cannot ignore any call. They call them, they have to go. They cannot know beforehand. If they start taking more, okay, you know what, let me sit on the phone and take all the information and let me decide if I'm going to come or not. They cannot risk that. So part in the long term, or the greater picture, every case where they are summoned is pikuach nefesh. It has to do with saving a life. And since we saw that Rabbi Yosef Karo writes that putting a fire on Shabbat is only forbidden by rabbinical law, the potential danger of losing a life or bringing the system to a halt is worth it to do that on Shabbat. But God willing, we have to be careful.
Makes sense.
Right.
But then in Israel, they don't have no other people.
Right. In Israel, it's mostly Jews who should work there, and it's really recommended to have as many observant Jews also involved in that. But we conclude that with the wish that everybody would be safe and careful, and the most important thing is really preventive measures. Smoke detectors, alarms, setting alarms in every floor of the house, including the basement, and especially in bedrooms near sleeping quarters, because people, when it's sometimes in a remote room, people don't hear it or ignore it. So that's a mitzvah to really take all these preventive measures. Baruch Adonai, Olam, Amen.